And you'll do great. The less you know, the better you'll do. I'm going to take one picture, and somebody else take another picture while you're doing this sometime during the thing. Akira's going to take some pictures, and that way we'll be sure we have enough pictures to satisfy everybody.
So I should pretend I'm speaking?
Yeah, pretend you're speaking.
Hi, I'm speaking right now. I'm pretending to speak. Making this argument right now. Making an excellent point.
That was an excellent point.
Yes, I agree. It was excellent. Should I show the next slide just in case? Oh wait, no.
No, that's okay. Because as Narahiko pointed out, I'm not sure if that's actually taping though.
Yeah, so
well, anyway, I told them to take pictures. You're going to take pictures.
Take one more now. So
that's
like
good.
This.
I've already got 4.
I'm making a good point.
All right.
Yeah, there we go. I'm done.
Wow, best lecture I ever had.
I agree.
I'm sad that I have to go to the other room and talk about that. Have fun.
I will. ビデオとか撮られるんでしたっけ？あれはついていい？ Technical stuff for me to get money. あ、録画されてます。Oh shit. It was already recorded. So. Great. Hello everyone. For those who are meeting for the first time, hi, I'm Akira. Nice to meet you all. So today, what I was going to do was on motion analysis and framing debate. If people are comfortable with this topic, I'm happy to go on with this. If you have other topics that you want me to cover over the next 1 hour, no, 2 hours, is there any things that you would like me to cover in the next 2 hours? Anything? Or else I'm just going to say good things for 2 hours. But is there any specific things that you would like me to cover? Like anything is fine.
I want to know how to rebut.
How to rebut? Okay. Anything else? Yeah, go ahead.
POI.
Sorry?
POI.
POI, okay. So I have 1 hour for rebuttals. So it will be very interesting. Anything else?
I want to know what is grade comparison.
Grade comparison. Okay. Anything else? Yeah.
Making clashes.
Making clashes. Okay. Okay. Anything else? Are we good? Oh, if there's anything that comes across in the next 2 hours, please do feel free to stop me anytime. Okay. Where should I start? Let me think. As a content, what I did prepare was. Wait. This is difficult. There we go. There we go. It took me less than a second. So what I did prepare was analyzing motions. So this is what you need to do during prep time. So this is one thing I could go over, meaning that how you should develop a strategy, how you're going to win the debate, how you come up with brainstorming ideas, or I could talk about argument generations. I'll just go over what I had as a menu. So if you're interested in it, I will do cover them. I do have something about framing, meaning that if you've heard of a concept, it's about how you make your argument more persuasive by analyzing certain ideas from certain perspectives. So meaning that, think of a picture, like if there's any picture or photo, in of itself is always good, but if you're able to frame it with a good frame, that picture will be more interesting and appealing. That is something I could have a discussion on. Yes, I need to go over things like rebuttals, POIs, not models, but comparison class. I did prepare that, but I think that, I don't know, I guess I could do that now, although I had a session reserved tomorrow too. So I think this is probably an area I could talk about. Is there any things that attracted you so far? If not, I'll just start. I don't have a specific slide for it, but I could talk about rebuttals. Is that okay? Or framing? Oh, okay. I'll talk about a bit of framing then. Great. So how many of you have heard of the concept of framing? Okay, 1 or 2 or 3 of you. Oh yeah. So framing is a concept to make. So okay. First thing, before I go any further, I'll assume that all of you have done debating before to a certain extent. Good? Okay, great. I'll assume that. If I'm going too fast or if I'm going too advanced, feel free to stop me anytime, because I'm not sure about the level of debating that's applicable for everyone. So, framing. So framing, as I told you, is thinking. It's to make an argument more attractive. So like I think all of you now is able to come up with an argument when you see like a certain debate or a certain topic or motion. So, but if the same argument is told from different perspective or lenses, that could make your idea much more delivered in more substantially persuasive way. So even if you're talking about exactly the same thing, if it has different lens or different framing, that makes it more persuasive. I think framing ultimately becomes your strategy as well. It's about if you're able to frame your argument in the best way, that could be very effective in winning against opposition too. I think there are 2 things you should be noting when I talk about framing. This is a concept I believe in. Maybe different people believe in different types of definitions, but I think there's 2 types of framing. The first is what I call absolute framing, meaning that explaining why your argument is important without relations to other arguments. So in of itself, like if you say, for example, there's problem with, for example, certain argument, you could talk about why genocide is problematic. I'm pretty sure you don't have to make relation with other argumentation. Genocide itself is quite something problematic. Or if you are talking about environmental problems in of itself, maybe if you have more pollution, and that's damage the environment, that's damage individuals, that's obviously problematic. So you could say an absolute framing is saying that why your argument is important without making any relation with other things. This is quite effective when you're talking about very intuitive arguments. So for example, let me give an example. So for instance, if you're talking about, say a motion of this has to ban tobacco, very classic motion. If you're in opposition, you used to say that the freedom of choice is important because you want to, well, I don't personally smoke, but there are many people who like to smoke, and that's exercise liberties, that people want to relieve their stress, sometimes necessary for their social relationships, those things. Or, like, for example, if we're talking about this has to introduce a quota for female politicians, for example, saying that female not being able to participate in politics in itself is a problem, that they're able to exercise the way they want to is a benefit. That is absolute framing. Also, if you're protecting the rights of minorities, that's very, very effective too. If you're talking about LGBT communities, religious minorities, ethnic minorities, if you say that these individuals deserve a right, whether or not they're majority or minority, they cannot choose to be born in minority, those things is an absolute framing. Relative framing is explaining why your argument is important in relations to other arguments in debate. This happens in 2 ways. One, in directly with clashing, I think those just sort of answers a bit of making clashes. If you say this argument directly clashes with opposition or government argumentation, that's one relative framing. You're making relations that this argument is clashing, or like, for example, directly answering the premise of the other side. For example, let's take an example of yeah, so as I said, this has to introduce female quota in the parliament or the diet, meaning that, for example, 10 or 20% or 30 or 50 maybe aggressively, a certain portion of the politicians have to comprise of female. Assuming that this motion exists, government would probably talk about female needs to female representation is important. Opposition, depending on their stance, will talk about different arguments. For example, they could talk about gender should not be in place, about people should be decided based on who they want most represent, whether or not it's maybe their ideology or their political views that they support and all those things. Or they could also argue to a certain extent about meritocracy as well, if they want to choose certain people based on their ideas, if they're capped by the programmatic. If government runs an argument, for example, to say this policy would lead to more competitions among politicians, to say, for example, since there's a quota, what would happen is more female would be empowered to go into the politics because there's opportunities there and doors open for them. Male politicians also have to compete because there's going to be quotas, meaning there's a high possibility they'll be kicked out. So there'll be more effective competition to make sure to increase the quality of politics. If that argument stands, that itself you could say that quality of politics increases. That's an absolute framing. But if you make it relative framing, it will be clashing with opposition's premise. Meaning that opposition say you're unable to choose certain people, that's problematic. You could argue and frame it as just a transitional harm at best, meaning that it may happen, I don't know, maybe 1 or 2 years down the line, but the long-term gain of competitions will be you are able to more choose individuals based on your beliefs and ideology and competitions. That's the idea I got. Is everyone all right with this idea? Am I going too fast? Am I writing it too messily? I know my writing is very difficult to read. I agree. So that's an idea. So that's one thing I would do. Technically speaking, for relative framing, that could be relevant to your arguments that your partner has made. So for instance, you could say that this is female representation that happens. Prime Minister talked about this female representation. You could talk about and frame your argument and say this competition is a secondary argument which stems from female representation. So if this happens in the initial time frame, you could say in the longer time frame and long term, not only talking about short term, this is what's going to happen. That's another way of framing. So this relative framing becomes especially critical when you're talking about second speaker and onwards. Because one, when your argument is just there, but just say, why is your argument important? That's more difficult for individuals to understand because simply speaking, second speakers have to make arguments which is less intuitive. So that happens a lot. So, but if you're able to frame it in a way that clashes with opposition's argument, just to say, oh, this argument is important because directly tackling their case. Or you could, if you say it's an extension of your first case, then that's easier for judges to convince and put into reason for decision. So if you have had any experiences when you make arguments, but just say, oh, but I don't necessarily think that argument was important, maybe that's a problem framing to make it relative to other things. So that's an idea of framing. Is there any questions or comments on framing?
Are there any types of framing which is defined for time frame?
So are you asking, is there any other ways to frame except time frame? I think there are many ways. One way is to frame it in the perspectives of actors, saying that, for example, technically, this debate can also be about, well, it would be. For example, if you take an example, female quotas, another actor that will be affected is obviously male. So you could say that in terms of actors, opening or the prime minister talked about from female, what I'm going to talk about another 50% of population, i.e. male, so to make it your argument more relevant. If you were to, one thing I would say is, if you're making those kind of argumentation, sometimes that actor is relatively, how do you call it, less intuitive for judges to put into consideration. So I think you should also conduct absolute framing to say why that argument is important too. So you should say, given that male also comprises of 50% of the population, this argument is also important too. So that's how I would frame it. So that's one way. Technically, I think their time frame and actors are two things I would say. You could talk principle and practical too, but I think those are two things I would necessarily have in mind. Yes, that was an excellent question. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
How do you practically explain the absolute framing?
That's a good point. That's a very good point. So for instance, let's take an example. I think one rule of thumb that I always have in mind is to explain your argument until it's very able to be picturized, meaning that you're able, to the extent that's very visual and very vivid that individuals, all people, really irrespective of their backgrounds, are able to say, oh, this argument is critical. And I think one rule of thumb I also have is to talk about the negative impacts as opposed to positive impacts. Meaning that people feel more fear and more persuaded when you talk about a negative perspective rather than a positive perspective. So if you were told to say, for example, how should I say, if something will be taken away from you, something will be deprived from you, people will be more defensive against it. People will say more intuitive, that's more damaging. So rather than saying that people have the right to, for example, go to school, rather than saying it that way, you should say more like people will be deprived of going to school, cannot go to school. Although I'm saying exactly the same thing. When you say it in a negative way, people will say, oh, that's problematic. So if you're saying using more positive words in absolute framing, try to use much more negative ones. That's because that's more intuitive. Yes, that was an excellent question too. There is no good or bad questions, so feel free to jump in at any time. And any other questions on this topic? Are we good? Really? Okay. Great. So what I should also talk about is rebuttals then. Let's see, what should I do? In terms of rebuttals, I think first of all I should take about 5 or 10 minutes right now for all of you to think about what are the types of refutations that you've known or you were taught. Meaning that for me, I think there's mainly 4 types of rebuttals. That's my idea, but before I go on, I think it's very important for us to brainstorm what are the types of refutations you do. So like one refutation type I've heard, and probably hopefully taught by Kip too, is not true refutation, saying that that argument is not true because of X, Y, Z reasons. If you say, I don't know, like saying directly engaging with logic, for example, that's one refutation. Another probably refutation is talking about examples, saying that that argument, that example is not relevant or not applicable. When you say about, so that's those sort of, like, for example, some of the examples of refutation types that you may have heard about it before or you may have done in your debating too. I think there are many other types of refutation. So what I would like you to do is, there's 7 people. Talk in groups of 3 or 4 with making sure that IFA people and Kyushu people are in the same group. Yeah, I need to do this. So talk with your colleagues to say, what are the types of rebuttals that you have done? It may not be, it may be 2 or 3, it may be 10, it may be 20, I don't know. So have a chat for about 10 minutes and let's have a time to discuss. So divide into groups. Or you can discuss instead of me going on.
Oh, okay, it's great. Okay.
I'll give you.
I'm not sure what types of recording exist. Just say this is not true. That's
I can't use this. The first thing that comes into my mind is say that I don't know if the opposition team comes up with a solution. I might say that it's gonna be useless. It's gonna be bad as well. Even if you implement the solution, it's gonna be useless. It's gonna be
I sometimes state that
So opposition
you can
land
fulfill
the
the order.
Yeah, it's not gonna work.
For example, the motion about this as bad for the government can
Opposite
tobacco is providing for
result.
health.
It's gonna
But
result in
on
opposite
the other
result.
side,
I see, I
can
see.
easily come to here and say the whenever tobacco is harmful, government should not ban tobacco.
Or
That's what the
agreeing with
group
that
is saying. It's not
argument
fulfilled.
particularly for
Sometimes I'm worried
not
about
wanting
lacking
to 100%.
So
Maybe their plan can, to some
Yes,
extent, solve this problem, and not
especially
to make them
when
take
I-
from it.
I'm a big speaker. I'm trying to.
Kind of agree with the opposition's arguments for not
Oh.
Statics. I'm not sure. Sorry.
Basically, I usually divide rebuttals by their function. So, like, I personally divide them to mitigatory rebuttals. Like, it's similar with what you said just now. Like, maybe some of your analysis are correct, but you cannot achieve the goal that you promised to achieve. So, just to reduce the impact of the lens argument. And the second type is, I call it flipping. To the noun version of flip. So to flip opposition's argument to say, like you mentioned earlier, to say it actually makes the situation worse. Yeah. And the third type, I call it preemptive rebuttal. I assume a better version of the opponent. I'm not sure if my spelling is correct, but preempt. I think there's one more E, P-R-E-E-M. It means that although opponent didn't say that that will be their, what they can get, their benefit, I would say that maybe you can get this kind of benefit, but actually you cannot. It cannot sounds complicated, but it's to assume that you have a stronger opponent and they did a better argument. Yes. And to explain why that,
I don't
like,
this
simply speaking, is to help them to better construct their argument and rebut to the better version.
Okay. So when the government defines the motion,
Yes, that's
you
government side would
want to
like
add one more between mitigate 3 and it's
Well,
to
it's very stressful for other persons.
unification, to make it clear. But
But
yeah,
their
to
assumption
say
is
that
type of
their
work
argument is not
always
true at
bad
all.
for every citizen. But you know, on the other hand, there is a person
Is it like
who still
possible to
know
say that?
the
Yeah, I
kind
think so.
of dangerous
Yeah.
or harmful.
It's
But
basically
they will
telling
try
the
to
judges how to
enjoy this
do it.
scenario, like so
In bullshit.
like that.
Yeah. If they provide a
The
mechanism of
parameters
how
change.
this would work,
You know,
you can
most
say
of
that
every single
see
citizen
this mechanism would not work because
don't
blah, blah,
like
blah.
tobacco
But
or don't know
if
that
the judge think
how
your
I
explanation
also
is
come up
more
with
plausible,
examples.
I think
Motion
that
is about
like completely
this has to prohibit children from engaging in professional sports. If the government came here and saying that children will be suffer through the process of the professional sports, then their premise is after children are suffering, no doctor can save children. But that assumption is not true because any other actor can save children. For example, if the exploitation happens,
I think there's another way to divide different types of argument
from
and
exploiting
rebuttals
professional sports.
by looking at where does this rebuttal target at.
That's not
Because rebuttal is like to deconstruct your opponent's argument, right? And we know that arguments are composed of different parts. There's assertion, there's mechanism, and there's example, and that sort of thing. And different rebuttals might attack to different part of that argument, different structure of that argument. So I think it can be also divided in that way.
Necessis, what was it?
But
This house
then there will be overlap
envisions,
between this type of
victors of
categorization
sexual
and that
harassment.
kind
And the government
of
team is like,
based on
we will 100% put them to jail. And then the opposition side was kind of like, but then I think education is more important. Isn't it? So that was the opposition and the government. So I was the government side, and we were thinking as a group, and then we were thinking about the hostile rebuttals that would come up. And we thought they would 100% say that education is important. So what would we do? And then we said, maybe you can say that we will give education in the jail, but then that's also self-contradiction, you know, because it's jail and education can't really go together.
maybe it's possible.
Maybe it's possible. Yeah, I thought it. I'm sorry, I'm like new, so.
I have another example. The same motion as I provided, professional sports. So the government came here and saying that after children engage in professional sports, another choices for children will be applied. For example, if children have to engage professional sports constantly, they don't have any chances to go to high school or university. Their choices will be applied. But on the other hand, the government side already declared that if the motion takes place, the government will declare the choice of the children to become professional sports, professional. So that's a self-constructive because a choice expansion, the principle from government side is based on the choice expansion is important, but on the other hand, government side already declared the choice of the children.
However, we make our arguments just like we need high education.
education rather than
So, but then Peter pointed out that it's not mutually exclusive. Like jail can serve as educational.
I think this is another type of, it's not technically rebuttal, but
This is good. Even if
but
they
it serves the similar function as rebuttal. It's all like making your argument doesn't make sense
that
in
we
the debate.
can concede the positions of argument that means
I usually would
we will try to
categorize that
rebut first
to like
like
outframing,
that it's not true or something.
because like
Or
you earlier
the possibility
explained,
is
framing,
also
outframing
it's
the
never
reverse
harmful.
process to
And so
explain
that
why
even
this
if
argument
it's
is not important.
in the paradigms, but
For
still
example,
there's
if it's not mutually exclusive, if there is
cover zero
those
competitions
two
when
paradigms
it's just
will
not
happen. So it's not the main discussion debate.
So we were agreeing with that the idea of Jason. But we were saying that education, the punishment isn't enough to educate students. So additional
he
I
came
think
up
in that motion,
so
like,
many types of
I think maybe
No,
it's
no.
what the motion
I also think about
because as opposition,
out the
you cannot
existence
agree with the government and say we need to do something additional. You need to disagree with the government.
the jail stuff.
To say why the mandatory punishment should not be taken. Like according to the rule of parliamentary debate, that kind of argument
that's
called
government
squirrel.
center when chances to provide quota.
their argument is not conscious.
Oh, yeah.
So you can argue
So
like,
double side
because like
protects
if you imagine the parliament, it's like the government want to make a policy.
by proceedings.
So in the end, if this
opposition side
policy
can say,
is
right,
got
yes,
proven,
we also
they
want to
mean the
protect
government
this paper
because they achieved their goal
activities,
of having their
we can
policy
do
passed.
also the other
Right.
ways.
So if you're an opposition party, you say, okay, I agree.
Okay.
So it means various professional sports is that
But
the
that the government they already achieved their goal, then it's a separate debate. Do you want to have education or not?
even if
you were
their paradigm still children will be exploited because of the existence of club activities or the system of mental possible club scheme.
Like,
That's why the exploitation is
as a prank
I might say that because you have a mandatory punishment, does that mean it's like anyone it's the same punishment regardless of their personal situation?
government
I think pointing out exclusivity is
the government came up with the idea that if it's cruel crime, they will give longer sentences, and if it's like minor things, they're like fair.
Like that depends with the school.
But I don't know. Some government team came up with really concrete.
I'm not sure this is the
period, like 6 months.
sometimes oppositions
So
and
here's
houses
the
challenge the definition of government
education.
without knowing
Yeah.
much about the penal code
Yeah.
and government penal code
You were saying like 6
academic
months
field
is not enough
and
to
take the government
educate the criminals.
we should the penal code should be should be introduced.
You guys are
only
even
in
more
everyone
supportive than the government.
student stuff. Because all students consisting of female students. That's the conclusion has to challenge the main issue.
We had that motion on our club tournament. Unpaid internship.
That is very difficult motions.
I was on competition team again. You were.
No, you participate in this council for this
Sorry.
long-term unpaid interns.
I'm just saying that company is company teacher and intern is another student.
I think that's
So-
a good argument.
It's not. And teacher
don't have to pay for the students. I mean, students have to pay for the course.
I see.
Yeah, kind of was.
Are you good?
Maybe.
Really? Great. Great. Yeah, I was just making slides. Yeah, great. Yeah, I just made 2 new slides. Yeah, it's good to work.
You're so smart.
I know. Anyway, so what happened? So could you tell us the types of rebuttals or refutations? I think you were going through some examples too. So like, please share it to the floor from anyone.
That is not likely to happen.
Okay. Not likely to happen. Oh wait, I have a better idea. I should just take notes here. I'm too smart. Hold on. That didn't sound smart, but hold on. Okay. Great. Hold on a bit. No, it's not POIs, refutations. Okay, so T1 was not likely to happen, okay? Great. Anyone else? Anything else?
Not fulfill their burden.
Not fulfilling their burden. Okay.
Point out self-contradiction.
On.
You can say that what the other team is arguing is not the core point, and we should focus on some other more important area.
Okay.
That gives the premise for the other.
Okay, that's good too.
We also thought of 2 rebuttals that can be only done by the opposition side. So the first is challenging the definition that the government came up with. And then the second is coming up with an alternative, which is better than what the government suggested.
Interesting, interesting. That's good too. Anything else?
Not exclusive learning. This is something exclusive.
Great. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 types of rebuttals from one team. Wow. This is excellent. Anything else from your team?
This might be silly, but we can say our argument still outweighs the others.
Okay. That's good too. Argument outweighs Good, good. Anything else? Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, wow, 9 rebuttals. So your team has come up with 10 rebuttals. Let's start.
So we divided rebuttals like different ways of categorizing.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
So one way is to categorize rebuttals by its function.
It's okay, I have it in other slide. I'm fast. Don't worry. I'm good.
So in this category, we have mitigator rebuttals.
Okay.
And nullification.
Sorry?
Nullification. And you have
Nullification. Oh, okay.
And flipping.
Flipping.
And preemptive rebuttals.
Interesting. Okay.
This is the first category, and the second category is categorized by the target of the rebuttal.
Interesting. Okay. Target. Don't worry, it will be good. You are seeing new techniques for free.
Consulting firm.
Yes. Go on.
In this category, we have rebuttals to like the premise.
Premise. Okay.
And rebuttals to mechanism. And probably like rebuttals to examples. And yes, there can be other targets, so whatever targets of like the there's different composition of opponent's argument, so corresponding to that we can have different types of rebuttals.
Interesting. Okay.
And lastly, it's not technical the rebuttal, but is another way to engage with our opponent. So we categorize this as outframing.
Okay, that's interesting.
So the idea is the opposite of framing, as you suggest, that is to explain why their argument is not important in this debate, or not important comparing to our argument. So examples might include what earlier suggested by the other groups, such as the not being mutually exclusive. Or things like could not fulfill their burden. And etc.
Interesting. Anything else from the team to add on? No. Or from the teammates? This is excellent. Okay, thank you to the both of the teams. Great. They look fabulous. They look excellent. Let's see. I think they're all good. You don't need me to speak. Is there any questions that a team would like to ask the other team to clarify what they necessarily meant? So this is for the team 1, this is for team 2. Anything that you'd like to ask each other? No, I'll make it bigger.
I don't get the word
mitigatory is to when your opponent made an argument, they said the possibility is this high and the impact is this big. So mitigatory rebuttals are rebuttals that in the end had the function of mitigating those possibilities and harms. So in the end, after you did that rebuttal, the possibility might drop from 90% to 30%, and the impact might drop from 100 to 50 or 20.
Is there any specific examples of mitigatory rebuttal?
Examples, hard to come up with examples out of nowhere, but
It's somewhere, so it's okay.
About this House of Dan tobacco, if the opponents say they're like the citizens are completely deprived their right to choose because tobacco is their way of entertainment. Example of mitigatory rebuttals can be there are many other alternatives that can also like satisfy them and help them to reduce their stress. So even we do not allow them to use tobacco anymore, it doesn't mean that they're completely deprived their right to like have free choice and to release their stress and so on.
I think that makes perfect sense, yes. Another example I sort of just came into my mind is just something, for example, financially incentivize the donation of organs, for example. So basically, if I give my kidney or liver, I'll get this amount of money. Opposition could argue, well, government is going to obviously argue there's going to be more number of organs, therefore more people will be saved because people would like to be get money because money is a source of happiness. You'll know better in 5 or 10 years. I'm not that rich. Having that in mind, opposition could say a mitigated rebuttal is not necessarily all people is going to donate an organ. For example, in this is more or less an example, but when there was a blood donation with financial incentives, actually the number of donations has decreased because the community was more religious and they were reliant more on altruistic donations. But when there's financial incentives put into it, people felt, why are we making this altruistic act more financially by commercialism? When people actually hesitated to donate blood, yeah. So that could be mitigated rebuttal, saying that the impact of number of organs or donations is not as big as the government's necessarily say. Yeah, that just came into my mind, so to build on to what he has said. Yeah. Any other questions? To each side. For instance, I have a question to the first team. When you said about this is not the core point, let's focus on other main points. This sounds like an excellent rebuttal. Could you share me an example or two? Hi. Can you hear me? Good. There's no right or wrong. Please help me. I'm currently writing a textbook on debating, so I want ideas. So I'm going to steal your ideas, so please help me.
Maybe, for example, I just can't think of an emotion, so I just saw the one on the board.
Mm-hmm.
It says when introduce Velo, Coda, and Parliament.
Mm-hmm.
Is it right, Parliament?
Sure, yes.
And then the other side is talking about why it's important to put Coda in the, I forgot the word. What's that in English? Executives.
Sorry?
Executives.
Executives. Uh-huh.
in a company, then kind of like, that's not the point, or point where we have to focus on the quota and the parallel.
I see, I see, I see. So if they talk about something like not necessarily relevant to the emotion. I see. That makes sense. Thank you, thank you. Oops. Good. Any other questions to each other? They look excellent. Yes. I don't think I have to go over my slides. But yeah, I think they're good. I think this is excellent. I think the reason why I did this exercise is because I wanted you to sort of have a checklist of rebuttals when you're doing when you're standing up and in debating, because often the case you're only limited. You only have access to limited toolbox. Means that if you only know 3 types of refutation, at maximum you're only able to do 3 types of refutations. And the important thing what you should do, and what I do too, is when I hear opponent's case, I initially feel, oh, that's a strong argument. But if I could rebut it this way with this word, maybe not. Could I rebut it this way? Oh, maybe not. But could I rebut it this way? Oh, this is effective. You find an effective tool that could be used to effectively tackle opponent's side. So it's very important to have a great number of toolbox, to have which weapon to choose, depending on their argument, depending on maybe what your partner has previously said, because you won't repeat your partner as well. Important point is, this should be very exhaustive yet simple. Meaning that if there's too many, if there's 100 types of refutations people could do, I don't think I have time to go over all 100 of saying, oh, the 98th rebuttal would work. But I think at some time my speech time is probably over, so I'm doomed. So it's very important also to categorize. So I think the excellent thing that was done by the second team is you sort of try to categorize in the way to make saying by functions and targets. So this is very important. So I think one important lesson I would say for everyone is to say you should have your own toolbox in a way of your own category. Maybe this may be a very effective first step for you to build on. Maybe some people would come up with, whoa, there are different types of function. This could become in play. This could also be too. Like for instance, if I were to add things like self-contradictions, which came from this thing, where would this fit? For instance, if I were to ask the second team, which category would it fit? Yeah, my question was, if there's rebuttal called, their argument is contradicting, which type or category, where should I fill in that tool within this toolbox?
Depends on what kind of self-contradiction.
Well, of course. For instance, within an argument that I make a contradiction. I don't know, for some good reason.
Probably can goes to mechanism. Their premise is contradicting with their mechanism, or their examples is contradicting with their mechanism. Yeah, and in the first, like in the category, it's like function part. Maybe it can be mitigatory rebuttals or glorification.
Yes, exactly. Let's have just one more example. Let's see. How about coming up with an alternative? Where would that fit?
Preempting rebuttals.
That's one. So if, for instance, Prime Minister speak and talk about why you should ban tobacco because tobacco is very addictive, and when they say, as opposed to comparative, such as alcohol, you could say the uniqueness of tobacco is blah, blah, blah. That's probably dealing with alternatives. Dealing with alternatives from Prime Minister, for example. If I were to rebut from LO to say tobacco is not unique, probably that's going to be a mitigatory rebuttal to say there's other methods anyway. So that's one way. So yes, challenge the definition, maybe that's more outframing, if my understanding is correct. Not fulfilling their burden, maybe category by target of mechanisms or premise, maybe of outframing, I don't know. So but that's how you make your toolbox stronger. So if you once have a category like this, when you hear from your friends or your enemy, your strong rebuttals, you could say, oh, that rebuttal is good. You should, I should steal that rebuttal to make it in that category. So I think this was an excellent start, whether it be this or this. I think you now have a toolbox. So I think now what's important is to categorize and also add in to make sure you're able to sort of come up with effective rebuttals. My understanding rebuttals will be very consulting-ish. Yeah, if you're interested, you can take pictures because I don't want you to waste paper. I encourage you to take it in iPhones because that's much easier. That's why I take notes in my laptop. So I believe there are 4 types. Oh, okay, take your time. Great. I haven't shown this to anyone yet, so congratulations. It's the first time to be seen somewhere. For Japanese people, this will be on the blog very soon. So wait for that. So I think there are mainly 4 types of refutations that I think it may overlap with what you have already said. So I can't count. Y-axis, right, it's that the horizontal, vertical, is about what to refute, whether it be the impact, so why argument is important, or the mechanism, why argument is true. If I were to sort of correspond with the previous category, like this, premise and mechanism and examples are in the category mechanism. My understanding is more broad. So impact is talking about framing too, so those are the things. So that's the y-axis. X-axis is rebutting in absolute form or in a comparative form. I think this is a slightly difficult concept, so let me take a bit of time to explain. By meaning an absolute rebuttal, it's saying to an argument saying without any direct comparative to your own side or to your own argument. So only rebutting independent on their paradigm, on their model. Comparative is saying that may be true, but in comparative with us, that's not necessarily more true or less important. I think what's critical is, as many novice debaters today start from this type of rebuttal, truth versus absolute. Say that argument is not true, that argument will not happen, that our example is not applicable, that example you said is factually false. There's alternative to it. Those rebuttals, that's very easy to come up with. That's probably one of the easiest types of rebuttal. I'm not saying those are bad. It's just that's one of the easiest things that people start to think about. Another relatively easier argument, rebuttals that people think of is rebutting to the important, saying that that argument itself is not relevant or not important. So the example, for instance, about a team talking about the core point and the main non-core argument, for example. So especially when the other side is weak, when they talk about something completely irrelevant. So for instance, by banning tobacco, there'll be World War III. I don't know how that happens, but probably that's irrelevant. Unless I can come up with it, which is probably very difficult. So you can say that's not relevant. If you debate about Japan and Korea and you start talking about Europe, probably that's irrelevant. So that's very, very easy. So when the opponent is either novices or you're relatively a novice, that's easier rebuttal. Saying that argument not relevant or not important. Saying that, for another example, not important rebuttal would be saying, the government side could, I don't know, if there's a specific motion about the rich people's rights. For example, this has to ban gated communities. Gated community is in places like United States or even developing countries. You sort of have, the rich people have their very, very luxurious houses, maybe with guards, with fences, with surveillances and all those things. Government could argue that the rich people's right is not necessarily that important because they're really privileged anyway. It may not be the convincing rebuttal, yet I think that's to an extent effective rebuttal. So that was the two types. The comparative one is relatively a bit more difficult. The first thing, let's start with mechanism. Argument about, for example, saying not mutually exclusive is saying that that argument may be happening on your side too, but will also happen on our side too anyway. The difference between absolute and comparative is because you're saying this will happen in our model, our side as well. That's why it's more comparative. You could say the comparative may be better or worse. Or the opposite, saying the flip one is also on this. You could say the government is able to benefit, I don't know, opposition could benefit the female. Government says this will benefit female more in our side, in more comparison. This technically could be an argument too, but that's another form of rebuttal. Last but not least, this may be something that was a trend about 1 or 2 years and starting to become much popular too these days, is rebutting to the comparative in terms of impact. Saying that, for example, government could talk about right to life. Opposition could talk about right to religion, for example. Saying that which one is more important than another. One team could say right to life is more important because if you're dead, you are unable to exercise right to religion. That's why right to life is more important. That's an example. You could argue that if, say, the motion about legalizing torture for terrorists for interrogation, government is going to argue about fundamental human rights of, opposition is going to argue about fundamental human rights of terrorists who are convicted. That's very fair. Government is going to say we're talking about fundamental human rights of everyone to prevent terrorism in the first place. So you say, in terms of numerically, you're protecting more. So that's a sort of comparative refutation. I'm not saying I'm believing in those rebuttals, but that's some examples of refutation. This is how I categorize rebuttals. I'm pretty sure this is not an exhaustive list, especially, for example, when I think about self-contradiction. I don't think it's necessarily included. If I were to categorize, it probably would be here because it's rebutting to the mechanisms as being suggested. So I think I should update this in terms of contradiction. Mitigatory notification and flipping, for example, would be within the realm of here. If it's mitigatory, saying that will not happen in absolute way, then it kind of here. But if you say not mutually exclusive, then it happens in comparative. So I think that's how I would plot. So I feel this frame and matrix very effective for me because I feel it's more exhaustive because argument is only comprised of why it's true and why it's important. And I think how to rebut is absolutely comparative. I don't think there's any other options. So I feel this is exhaustive for me. People may have different understanding. I'm not saying they're right or wrong. But my key point is, if you, whether it be like this, or whether it be like category by function or target, it doesn't matter. As long as you have a tool that's effectively able to be used, and something you could be adding on when you hear other ideas, that's an important message I would like to say. so my message is rebuttals. I think we were quite exhaustive in terms of making sure what type of rebuttals exist, and I've also covered how you're able to effectively improve your refutation skills by having categories and ideas in it. Before I conclude this part, is there any questions on my matrix that I have right now? Or what I have just explained for 5 minutes? There's silence. Or any comments?
So in this form, you kind of incorporated comparison and also a part of framing into this refutation toolbox.
Sorry, could you explain?
So you kind of incorporated comparison and also framing into your refutation toolbox.
I think comparison comes in here. You're comparing with, sorry if I get your question correctly, about if you're saying X is more important than Y as a rebuttal, that's within here. Framing, say, I guess sort of the framing as to why the outweighing or outframing, saying why that argument not important, I feel it's coming in, for example, in here. If they talk about, right, oh, I don't know, religious minorities in this debate, then I think I can easily outframe in the first two works. But when you're talking mutually exclusive, it comes in here. So if I have different lens to organize, I think, so I think it's the first category is different. It's just, I agree with framing and comparison is important.
But I personally isolate refutations as things that deconstruct, and comparison as when you compare your leftovers and their leftovers. So I think in this way you are able to already do comparison within the process of replication.
Yes, that's an excellent point. I think the long-lasting dilemma or the questions that the debate community has experienced, at least for the past 10 years, is what is the distinction between argumentation and refutation? I think the line is very blurred. Some people believe that comparison is more rebuttal, where some people with comparison more on argumentation or substantives. I think both are fair. I think I take the definition refutation slightly a bit bigger in way to sort of incorporate it in this manner, because personally, when I rebut in debate life, if I only talk about non-comparatives, the judges tend to say, well, that's fine, but it's not as convincing. If I have the comparative aspect, that's when judges start to buy into my rebuttals much more. So I think for me, having this as a portfolio or a matrix work better. I think different judges have different weights on which arguments or which refutations they buy in a lot. For instance, based on my experience, Japanese judges or Korean judges tend to like rebuttals on mechanisms. I don't know why. I think those were something that was taught. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying that as my general tendency, I just felt. Recently, I feel that Southeast Asian judges are more running toward comparative rebuttals. That's what they like more. European judges tend to like the principal comparison because that was probably their taste too. So I think it really depends on the audience too. But for me, having refutation in this manner sort of made me able to convince quite a large number of audience. So that's my recommendation. Another thing I would say is this also could be used for generating ideas or coming up with argumentation too. So technically, if you thought of the argument to say, this is rather kind of productive, I think you should turn that into an argumentation because rebuttals is to spend 2 or 3 minutes to make it more strong. So that could technically happen. So I agree that the writer half is leaning toward more substantives rather than rebuttals for some people. I agree with that. But I think some people would count this as rebuttal anyway, so I think that's why someone put it into this box. I hope that makes it clear. Good? Great. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Are we good? Great. So I think I sort of did go into rebuttals and a bit of comparison. I may not have a bit of time with clashes. I promise to come back probably tomorrow. For POIs, I just did make a slide. I think they're, sorry, hold on a bit. I can do this. This is my understanding of POIs. I think there are 4 types of POIs. I think when you go to new rebuttals or failures, that's more stronger than what's on the top. So these are more weaker POIs. For my understanding, these are more stronger POIs. So there are 4 types. The first type is clarification POIs, asking the contents of what they have said. So this could be you're half asleep, for example, to ask about what they have said technically. Or technically when you said you had a different idea in opposition to definition, so you want to clarify whether or not that's included. For example, if government said this house would legalize drugs, if government talked about they will be legalizing things like marijuana or cocaine, marijuana for example, opposition, if they prepare the case on more hard drugs, such as cocaine and whatnot, opposition could technically argue it's not included with the definition. So it's more clarifying what government said. It's more of conversation rather than in strategic POIs. The second types of POI is reminding or hinting your argument. So especially this is applicable in later second speaker onwards, meaning that opposition, if they're not rebutting to an argument of government side, you say, oh, I made an argument about this, please engage with this. So it makes it clear to say, I've made this argument, forcing them to rebut. Another thing that happens, it doesn't happen in Asian parliamentary style that much, but it happens in BP style. If you're on you have 2 teams on both sides. Technically, if you were to state, put in an idea from the opening half, that's also a type of strategy a team could take. The third type of POI is a failure, pointing out the failure of the opponent team. You could say, same thing, why is your argument relevant? Why is your argument mutually exclusive? Why is your example relevant? What is your logic to say this happens? Why is it important? All those things, saying the failure of an argumentation. Say, to point out, this is more to point out to judges to say, oh, judges say, oh, I was convinced, but until the POI came, and if you're unable to respond, judges say, oh, maybe that argument is not that complete. And that could be tactically be used for your strategy as well. Fourth, and probably the strongest type of POI is directly rebutting to the contents. You could, rather than spending your time on rebuttal, especially when you don't have much more chance to rebut, is to sort of directly rebut to their new strong case. It may be their new argument, it may be their new rebuttal, it may be simply something very, very strong that came up from the opponent team. So you could inject POIs to saying that by using the matrix, for example, of this or the previous refutations, you could directly rebut to say your argument is not true because of X. What do you think about it? So my suggestion is POIs are heavily correlated to, sort of connected to refutations. So for this, make sure you pick the rebuttals. But if you're doing POIs, if you're more relying on clarification, reminding arguments, try to have POIs of failures or POIs of the rebuttals. Excuse me. Another thing about POI very tips that I have in mind is write down your POIs, because you often cannot put good ideas within 15 seconds. Also share your POIs with your teammate to decide which POIs to do, which one's more effective. I'm sorry, I'll get water very soon. Another third tip that I have is, if you're able to combine POI ideas, that's very strong too. By combining, I'm not saying you should say 3 things within 15 seconds. I'm not saying, oh, you should rebut to this, and you should rebut to this, and by the way, your argument is lacking of this. No, don't do that. What I'm saying is sort of have your POI to sort of incorporate the ideas for advanced debaters especially. What do I mean? For example, if you're combining instances, reminding your argument and their opponent's failure, if your argument had very strong logics as to how, I don't know, as how a certain sort of female representation is going to happen, where opposition didn't necessarily talk about why gender should not be categorized, you should say, we told you with 3 reasons as to why female representation is going to happen. Please engage with it. So you are pointing out your failures of lack of logic and also reminding your argument at the same time. So you sort of have this multiplier effect to happen. You could have a new rebuttal sort of combining with an argument too, saying, technically, my argument was preempting your rebuttal anyway, so you need to necessarily rebut to this. So if you had an argument that sort of had a uniqueness from the first speaker, you should say your generic freedom of choice will not necessarily happen by hinting your own argument and saying, why would this uniquely happen to your harm? Why? Or something like that. But you get the idea. My point is, if you're able to combine 2 or 3 of these boxes, that will be much more effective. This is more for offering POIs versus than taking POIs. If I were, sorry, I don't have specific slides. I need another 10 minutes to make slides. If I were to take POIs, some tips is 1, be strategic as to when you're taking POIs. Take at the most convenient time that you're able to. What I like the most is to take before my rebuttals and constructives, between rebuttals and constructive, because that I feel most comfortable in. Because that way, I've probably killed most of their cases. Are we going to my arguments? And so, if they talk about what I rebutted, I could easily say, oh, I already rebutted in my refutation. If they talk something relevant to my argument, I could easily say, oh, I'm explaining that in my second argument, so wait for that. And sort of incorporate it in there. So it's very tactic if you do it in between. That's one thing. Another thing I also have in mind is not to try to take it at the end of your speeches, because that way you're unable to present your strongest case sometimes. So take it as in earlier time as possible. That's another thing. Third thing I have in mind when taking POIs is take from the most strongest person. Don't take it from the most weakest person or relatively less experienced people. Take it from the strongest one. That shows your level of confidence. That shows from the judge saying, although this strong rebuttal did come, you're able to rebut. So that's very important. Always take from the stronger individual. If you're doing BP, from the stronger team, obviously, because that could be decisive in determining who could win and who could lose. Another thing that I take when I get POIs is to say, do answer on the point as quickly as possible if that's plausible. So do not say, oh, my partner is going to explain, or I'll explain later. Although that sometimes do happen, try to rebut on the point if that's possible. But if you cannot come up with ideas immediately, you should say that you do say I will necessarily do rebut later, and do be explicit in terms of that. Some people say I'll rebut later, but they don't. Don't do that. If you are actually rebutting within your argument, do say, and this answers your POIs about this, and say blah, blah, blah. So be explicit on that. Another thing I also have in mind is incorporate POIs, which was done before your speeches too, as much as possible. What do I mean? For example, if you're a second speaker of a petition, and if a POI was asked to the first speaker, and the first speaker did not necessarily answer, then you should answer instead. Say that this also answers a point of information from their side to my first speaker. Two responses, firstly, blah, 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 secondly, and all those things. That's when I'm answering POIs. The final thing I would like to talk about when I'm talking on POIs is to leverage your POIs too, to the maximum extent. For instance, if you were third speaker, if you're web speaker of government or opposition, this is also very effective. If you did do POIs of, for example, pointing out failures to the first speaker or second speaker's opponent, you should say, as I told in my pinpoint information, I pointed out their lacking of, for example, relevancy or exclusivity. They don't necessarily provide an answer. So do leverage your POIs as much as you can. That happens especially at advanced debaters when you state a certain idea. Say, I said an argument about this, but they don't necessarily rebut to this at any time. So you say, I gave them a chance, they don't necessarily rebut. So that's very important. So I've talked about for POIs, I think I've covered pretty much how you offer POIs. So that's one thing. Secondly, how you take POIs. And thirdly, very briefly, about how you leverage POIs. I hope that was clear. Any other questions on POIs? Anything is fine. Sorry, I have very bad short-term memory. Who asked about POIs? Was it her? Okay, so she left. So I think my words were very convincing that she had to leave.